And the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, which is an aggregation of all these tax justice groups in civil society around the world, has just been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So it's a great commendation, great tribute to John's vision back almost 20 years ago when he started Tax Justice Network, that it's being recognized as being a major contributor to bringing some equity in society. So I just wanted to say that. And John, it's a pleasure to share this platform with you. To the group, I would like to say that my role today is to show how tax justice can be a pathway to social justice. And I have some slides to go over, and realizing that, and I'll also cover my own experiences in Guatemala, in Zambia, in Mexico City, in working in tax justice, give some real life examples. But really, my goal is to show how the two are really connected. Tax justice and social justice are connected. And if since John is coming after me and he has a number of excellent slides to follow, I will try to go through my slides quickly. We'll have some Q&A right afterwards, and then John will take over. So John, I hope I won't take too much of your time, but let me go over this now. So let me share my screen. So how do we get this? So we go to the beginning. Just 1 second. I made a mistake of not coming to the beginning. So I'll just very quickly go through the top of my slides for a moment. Yeah, so this is the main theme we're going to cover: tax justice as a pathway to social justice. Now, very quickly, some of you may have seen the beautiful inauguration address in which Amanda Gorman made some very important comments, in which she said basically that, you know, the world, while we have our eyes on the future has its eyes on us. And our action and inaction during this period will be the inheritance of future generations. So in other words, COVID-19 has exposed a lot of fault lines in the American social system, tax system, public safety system, public health system, and how we act now will be a determinant as to how future generations will view this period. And what I will try to show is how tax justice can be a part of the decisions that we make during this period. As you all know, what is the state of our country? And again, this is a US perspective. There are almost 900,000 new jobless claims every week. Unemployment is at a high 6.7%. Student debt is very high. Some of the students who are here in this class know that among your peers. The food lines, you know, I didn't know that in the richest society in the world, there would be food lines that sometimes would stretch for hours. That is something that is a very concerning development. And yet we have 150 richest Americans that are worth $3 trillion. And their wealth has increased by 600 billion during this pandemic. In fact, if Jeff Bezos gave to each of his 875,000 employees a bonus of $120,000, he'd be at exactly the same place as he was at the start of the pandemic. So we are really seeing a situation in which a majority in the country are really hurting, but corporate America is doing very well. And as you see in this cartoon, Wall Street is at an all-time high. Here are three people who are out of work. One says, we'll work for food. And the other person is looking at a newspaper and says, look, great, the Dow is at an all-time high. And that is the paradox in our society right now. Markets are doing very well. Big corporations are doing well, but the public is really hurting. So how can tax justice be part of the solution is what we will explore. So what is tax? We all know tax is a contribution that people make for a functioning society, for education, for healthcare, for universities, for infrastructure, for roads and so forth. Tax justice is where people pay their fair share in contributing to that society. Tax injustice is when those who are able to pay their fair share but do not are, in a way, placing the burden of the tax responsibility on those in middle and lower income people who cannot avail of the opportunities that many people in the elite and many big corporations can avail. Joe Stiglitz has done some research, and he points to an IMF study that indicates that as a result of tax injustice, globally, societies lose about $500 billion a year in revenue, tax revenue, 500 billion, which is about 300 billion is lost in developed countries, 200 billion in developing countries. And if that resource was available to both developed and developing countries, our economic circumstances would be very different. And I can provide you information on those studies that point to this scenario. Now, there was a CBS program that pointed out how many corporations pay no taxes at all. And I'll just play a 1 minute or 2 minute clip from that program. And I want you to listen to this very carefully. Now, what is some of the, let me just go back for a moment to what are some of the root causes of this tax injustice? To those of us who are dialing in from America, you know that one of the big issues right now is all the immigrants that are at the borders and want to come from Mexico and Guatemala and El Salvador. And there's a big debate in America that is taking place as to whether there should be a wall should be built or what should be other ways in which to stop these immigrants from coming. But people don't understand that some of the root causes of these refugee crises at our borders goes back to Reagan's Economic Recovery Act of 1981, in which he passed a law that basically said that any offshore wealth that is brought to the US, there would be no income tax that would be paid by the non-residents who bring this money into this country. In addition to that, as is customary in the US, there'd be full banking secrecy provided to the funds that are brought into this country, and there'd be no reporting back to the home country of the wealth that has been brought in. Now, what is the result of this law change that came about in 1981 as a result of President Reagan? The result was that the US tax laws, as a result of these changes, there was a significant drain of wealth from other countries that came to the US because the income earned on that money would not be subject to tax in the US. There'd be no reporting back to the home countries. The local economies in Latin America suffered significantly because it was mainly actually the wealth of Latin America and South America was a major target for these countries, and because they viewed America as a safe haven for their wealth. And once the wealth has left those countries, we ended up with poor infrastructure, lack of economic opportunities, investments could not be made, and there was gang warfare and so forth, and people, understandably, in a state of desperation, came to the United States or wanted to come to the US as to bring about a better life for their families. So the point I'm trying to make is that when we think of the refugees at our borders, we tend to sort of label them as just economic refugees or people who are just coming here to the US because there are greater opportunities. But we don't really recognize the root cause of these refugees and how our tax laws have created the environment in which we have drained the wealth from these countries. And as a result of the economic collapse that has taken place there, the opportunities for them are very limited, and they have no choice for the sake of their children and future generations to try to come here for a better livelihood. That is lost in the debate. In fact, about 3-4 years ago, I wrote an article on this subject, which you can Google and find online. It was entitled, "Banks, Not Borders, Hold the Immigration Key." In other words, if we were to look at our tax laws and our banking laws and the banking secrecy that we provide, we would be addressing a big fundamental part of the problem that results in this major influx of people coming to the United States. Banks, not borders. And if you Google that, you will see that article, or I can send it to you if you can't find it. In fact, I remember being giving a talk in Mexico City one time, and somebody raised his hand at the end of the talk and said, "Mr. Mehta, do you think it's very fair that first you have all our wealth coming into your country?" And we talked about $870 billion that has come from Mexico alone from 1980, when this law was passed, 81, to 2010. That much wealth has come to the US from Mexico alone, leave alone other parts of Central America and South America. And the man was saying, first you change your laws to attract our wealth, and then you want to build walls. Is that really a fair situation? And this article that I refer to here is something you can read at your leisure. I'll give you another example of my work in Africa and some of the work that Tax Justice Network has done. And in fact, there's a very strong movement for tax justice in Africa that deals with the similar situation. As you know, Africa is the richest continent in the world. There are foreign mining companies all over, but there's hardly any tax paid in those countries. Locally, there's a small margin paid to countries in Zambia, Tanzania, and Nigeria and Kenya and so forth. But most of the profits are parked in Switzerland or Cayman Islands or other tax havens. And as a result, the poverty continues in Africa. I mean, I was surprised when I went to Zambia to see that, this is a country that has more wealth below ground than any other country in terms of gold and copper and silver and many other minerals that are used, lithium and so forth. But the poverty above ground is absolutely abysmal. Why? Because the mining companies that are there are making sure that only a small percentage of the profit is given to the governments there, and the rest of the ore is sold then for refinement in Western economies, and the profits is kept there. You may be surprised to know that Switzerland, from most of the mining companies have their subsidiaries in Switzerland, where they import this copper, and from there it is exported to the rest of the world. And it is quite ironic that Switzerland, that does not mine an ounce of copper, is the largest copper exporting nation in the world as a result of the way that the tax system is structured. I was doing some work in Zambia. In fact, here are some photographs from that trip. I mean, you look at these big machines that are doing excavation and mining. I'm standing next to the wheel of one of these trucks, the wheel alone is 20 feet tall. And here we are, you look constantly at the countryside being ravaged, environment being depleted, very few taxes paid, and incredible poverty above ground in spite of incredible wealth that is below the ground. So what is the price that is being paid for this injustice? What we see is that there is poverty and civil war in Africa, there's broken society, poor infrastructure, and the profits of the mining companies are largely in Western banks and in tax havens. Now, I remember listening to a talk by John Christensen one time, in which he explained that this is really no different than a new form of colonialism, where the Western economies provide banking secrecy, financial secrecy, and a tax structure to enable the wealth to be stolen. And with that, one doesn't need the British Navy or the army to continue to extract the wealth. So this is something that the world doesn't really focus on sufficiently, in realizing that we are continuing a form of exploitation in these countries that are resource rich by having a financial and tax architecture that takes away their wealth through the system that has been created with support from Western economies. Why? Because they're the beneficiaries of all that wealth. So we have provided the getaway car for all these resources to be drained. And if we see civil war or refugees from those countries, there's a reason why that is the case. I saw the similar situation in Guatemala, where I did some work, and American agricultural plantations that own a lot of plantations are all over Guatemala. And what we found is that for every dollar that people were paying for bananas, for example, or other agricultural produce in the West, only 13% of the sale price was paid to the country where these items were grown. 40% was paid or recorded in the consuming country, which is the United States or Britain or elsewhere. And another 47% was recorded as a revenue in a tax haven. So as a result, the annual loss to Guatemala as being one of the largest agricultural exporting nations in Central America, the annual loss as a result of this tax arrangement was close to $500 million a year. Now, so as I said, what is the price we pay for this? We have subsidiaries in tax havens, profits are located there, financial wealth gets shifted, and local communities suffer. And in a way, this affects the social contract in those countries because it worsens inequality. There's a trailer that I want to play briefly from a movie that was made on this subject called The Price We Paid. That was one of the selections at the Toronto Film Festival. There's something wrong with the global trading system. If 75% of the profits of multinational companies are deemed to be earned in 4 tax haven countries: Switzerland, Singapore, Bermuda, and Cayman Islands. There's something. Now, let me go back for a moment on the comment I made earlier, the study, IMF study that Joe Stiglitz was pointing to. He said that the total tax loss by developing countries annually as a result of the use of tax havens, the 4 tax havens that I mentioned in this clip from the movie Price We Pay, is around $200 billion a year. Now, let's put this in perspective. Many of you know that it was the Marshall Plan from 1948 to 1952 that helped the recovery of Europe after World War II. Germany was a major recipient of the Marshall Plan aid, and it helped Europe recover. Now, if I ask you a question, how much did America provide as a loan to Germany at the end of Second World War to make possible the recovery? It was around $30 billion from 1948 to 52 in the dollars at that time, which in present value terms is close to $100 billion. So if we just compare that, the developing countries are losing $200 billion a year in tax revenue as a result of tax havens, and this is twice as much as what was the total investment in the Marshall Plan for the recovery of Europe. So if we think about it, if the developing countries had these resources there in their economies, rather than being drained through tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions back to Geneva or to Switzerland and Amsterdam and to the US and so forth, the possibility of recovery in Africa, possibility of growth in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere would be great, because they would not be losing twice the amount of the Marshall Plan every year. And that's something that is somewhat not known in the public debate. You know, we think of these countries being poor because somehow they're not hardworking, or somehow they are corrupt, or they have bad leaders. But the truth is, we have helped create a financial system and a tax system internationally that makes these countries lose close to $200 billion a year, twice the Marshall Plan, which, if we were not party to that through that exploitation or getaway car, they would have all the resources they need for their own development, and they would actually not need any foreign aid at all. I will now show you a trailer that the movie Price We Pay, there's a trailer to it that you will find very interesting that goes into how Apple has a large portion of its income offshore. Barclays, where John Christian is from the UK, Barclays has around 181 subsidiaries in tax havens. And let me just play that very briefly.
Does Apple Inc. own directly or indirectly AOI, AOE, ASI?
Yes,
And where is AOI a tax resident?
it does not have a tax residency.
We're talking about 10 to 15% of the world's financial wealth basically being invested offshore beyond the reach of tax authorities.
So far from being a success story, I regard the City of London as the world's biggest tax haven.
Can you tell me how many subsidiary companies of your group are incorporated and operating in the Cayman Islands?
I don't have that number with me.
You have 181.
There are $1.6 trillion booked to Cayman Islands banks. Almost none of that is actually in Cayman.
Many politicians have an illusion that they actually run their country, when actually they run their country within the confines that the global financial system places on.
There was a period before we had a welfare state. We had the welfare state under a certain set of conditions, and those conditions have changed.
This social contract is broken.
People didn't invest money into services. I mean, you look at the state of the roads here, the most basic thing, and there's potholes everywhere. Property tax they're introducing, water tax, all these new taxes, personal taxes.
What's different about Google, we're not selling books and we're not making coffee. The consumers are based on the computer science. That is what creates the economic value for Google.
What does Bermuda create?
Kodak had hundreds of thousands of employees, really good, solid middle-class jobs. The new world of photography is Instagram, which had 13 employees and sold for $1 billion to Facebook.
Les entreprises meurent sous l'effet de cette révolution industrielle et cessent de payer des impôts. Se déplacent vers les paradis fiscaux.
At some point, more inequality is not simply more inequality. It needs another name. People are being expelled from livelihoods.
We are the 99%! We are the 99%!
People used to, in their positions, use that money to invest in our country, to invest in people, and they're not doing it anymore. And as a nurse, I would say they're probably a little bit mentally ill. It's not normal to want to hoard all that money. And the people in this country need it.
We pay all the tax you require us to pay in the UK. We paid $6 billion of tax last year.
We're not accusing you of being illegal. We're accusing you of being immoral.
I think this, by the way, going back to that trailer that we just saw, I would urge you to look at this movie called The Price We Pay. It's we have put it online. There's no cost to that movie. Have you look at it for an hour and a half. It explains the subject in more detail. John Christensen was is featured in this movie, and you'll hear from him in a few minutes. But he also was instrumental in not only that movie, but also another movie called The Spider's Web, which explains all the tax havens around Britain that were former British, that still are actually British colonies or British protectorates, and how they continue to be used as a source of tax revenue that is in effect coming from Africa, Central America, and elsewhere, and then flows into the Bank of London. So if we allow this system to continue, what is the net result? And I think this cartoon says it all. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. And I think that's what we are seeing, because the markets are doing very well while the public is hurting, whether it is in the US or UK or parts of Africa or Central America and so forth. When there was a proposal, when President Obama was elected in 2009, as you know, there was a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and of course the presidency was in a Democratic hands. And at that time, there was a strong campaign being made by the tax justice movement to have this whole tax haven industry being stopped. In fact, Senator Carl Levin proposed a bill called Stop Tax Haven Abuse Act. And at that time, when he proposed that bill, the New York Times came out with an editorial that said, $100 billion that this country can use. In other words, if we eliminated the use of tax havens by multinational companies operating around the globe, US alone would benefit to the extent of $100 billion a year. Now think of it, this was back in 2009. And the US would benefit to the extent of 100, and as Joe Stiglitz mentioned in his IMF study, the entire developed world would benefit to the extent of 300 billion. And as we know, post-COVID, all countries are going to be looking for resources. So this really becomes something that is available as an access, as a source for countries to tap into if they want to solve some of the economic disruptions that are going to come about, because all countries have borrowed heavily to pay for COVID. How will they pay? How will they recover and make their economies whole? And certainly this is a subject that has to be revisited, especially in the post-COVID environment. I mentioned earlier this movie called The Spider's Web, which I would urge you to see, that John was instrumental in producing. In fact, and this is a poster, one time the Tax Justice Network had organized a conference on the subject of tax havens, and this was one of the posters in a telephone booth in London, which said, "Welcome to the City of London, tax haven capital of the world, where the world's wealth comes to hide." And of course, John can talk more about it when he comes on right after me. The US itself is also a tax haven. 70% of Fortune 500 companies are located in Delaware. And Delaware is, of course, the state where our current new president has been a senator for over 30 years before he became vice president. From 1972 till 2008, he was a senator from Delaware. He did all he could to protect Delaware as the tax haven capital of America. And whether this will change in the new administration is anybody's guess. There are 1.5 million companies that are registered in Delaware. And as you know, think of this, there are only 970,000 people in Delaware, but 1.5 million companies that are resident there. Financial secrecy is provided by Delaware, and from Delaware, there's an easy connection to the tax havens overseas. John F. Kennedy is one of the persons I admire a lot. He was one of the first presidents who recognized the damage that tax havens cause. And I want to just, and he proposed in the tax reform bill of 1962, an effort to stop this. In fact, he's the only president who has taken a courageous stand on this issue. And I want to just play for you a 45-second clip about a speech that he gave on this subject, in which he made a case to stop tax havens.
Next, I want to take this opportunity to stress again the importance of the tax bill now before the House of Representatives. An attempt is being made in that House to defeat this bill by sending it back to committee. And if it is killed, we will be abandoning an effort to close off foreign tax havens that drain our jobs and dollars away from our shores. And we will be permitting $630 million a year in taxes due from stockholders and bondholders to go uncollected, which means that those wage earners, small businessmen and others who have their taxes withheld from their salaries and their paychecks must pay more. I hope that every member of the House of Representatives who believes in spreading the tax burden fairly, who wants to improve our balance of payments position, who wants this country to grow with new equipment and new jobs, will support this bill as the best means of achieving these goals today. And I find great difficulty in understanding the position of any political party, which makes it a matter of party objective to defeat this bill at this most important time. Next.
Now think of this, Kennedy talking in 1962 of a bill that would bring to America's treasury close to $630 million a year, back in 62. The tax reform bill that he proposed then would have put a stop to this. But again, the business industry lobby was very strong. They talked about how if such a bill was passed, American companies would lose their competitive edge over European and Japanese and other countries, and they prevented him from making the changes that he really wanted to make. Now, John will cover this. My next slide is also very important because, and John will cover this in a moment. Here are some people who are lining up on tax avoidance advice, whether it is by law firms or accounting firms. And in the other person who is also offering advice on the meaning of life, there is nobody there. And there's a whole industry that is actually working with and supporting multinational corporations in perpetuating this status quo. Now there's the business argument. Let's also look at the counter argument for a moment. Milton Friedman says that corporations have an obligation to maximize their return to shareholders. Ayn Rand, obviously, I mean, she has written extensively in her books and so on about how the pursuit of self-interest leads to the well-being of society. But I think what they are missing in Adam Smith's doctrine, in which he says that markets depend on morals, that unless companies are acting in a prudent way that reciprocates to society what it provides them protection of intellectual property, it provides them skilled manpower, it provides them schools where these people are educated, it provides hospitals that people can go to when they fall sick. So there's a responsibility that corporations have to society that need to be honored and not just maximizing profit interest. And when companies don't pay the taxes that are due to societies where they are operating, they are not honoring their responsibility to one of the primary stakeholders in those companies. So it is not just the shareholder who needs to be rewarded, but also the stakeholder that makes this success possible. But, you know, as John will make clear in his talk about how, you know, there's a whole army of lobbyists who work closely with multinational companies and with politicians to ensure that the bills are designed in a way to continue the status quo, whether it is the tax haven industry, the financial secrecy, the banking secrecy. And here's one lobbyist talking to another. Thank God you cannot legislate morality. So that's something to reflect on. What are the current initiatives underway? I think I'll briefly go over this, and I know that time is running short and John is needing to come on soon. We are looking at the Independent Commission for Reform of Corporate Taxation is working closely on this whole issue of unitary taxation and also a corporate minimum tax as a way to replace the current abuse that is evident and is widespread through the use of tax havens. And Joe Stiglitz and Jose Ocampo, who are very closely aligned with that group, and I'm a member of that steering committee, the Independent Commission for Reform of Corporate Taxation, that is working on this issue. One of our co-instructors in this program, Jim Henry, is working hard with New York State Assemblyman Phil Steck on the issue of a stock transfer tax for New York, where a rebate of a stock transfer tax that is currently collected by New York State is rebated back to the banks and the corporate sector. And he is working hard to repeal that rebate, to basically allow it to stay in the taxpayer's exchequer rather than to have it paid back to the companies. In the US Congress, there's a bill that has been co-sponsored by Peter DeFazio and James Clyburn and also Ro Khanna on the stock transfer tax. There is a proposal that has been submitted to the Biden administration on an excess profits tax, so that companies like Amazon and Netflix that have benefited significantly from the pandemic can pay a higher share of tax revenue. I mean, some of you, many of our students are much too young to know this, but back in 1974, 75, when there was an oil embargo and the oil companies made tremendous profit, at that time in the United States, there was an excess profits tax that had a tax rate of close to 75% for the big oil companies and over 50% for the independent oil companies to pay back to the government. So there's a precedent in the books, both in the US and Europe, for an excess profits tax that needs to be reopened as part of the public dialogue as how we pay for COVID-19 and to remove some of the tax inequities that exist today. There's an organization called the Center for Public Integrity that spawned a group called the International Center for Investigative Journalism that has also exposed how companies have used tax havens extensively to avoid paying taxes. The Panama leaks was a major leak of these corporate tax plans, and John will cover some of those in his talk. The Lux leaks, the Paradise Papers, all of these have been exposed by the International Center for Investigative Journalism, because the role of whistleblowers is very important, because without them, we will not have the confidential data that many of these companies have, which, working with their lawyers and accounting firms, they are able to put plans in place that minimize their tax obligations. And I mentioned in my opening remarks that the Global Alliance for Tax Justice is one of the nominees for the Nobel Peace Prize. The other group that has also been nominated along with the Global Alliance is the International Center for Investigative Journalism, for their very courageous reporting on this subject. And both together actually work hand in hand, because without the exposure of whistleblowers, the tax justice movement would not be as empowered as it needs to be able to be advocates for these issues. So again, I'll go through this quickly. What can the current US administration do? Reverse some of the 2017 tax changes that were brought about under President Trump, former President Trump, to stem the abuse of tax havens, whether it is London, Delaware, Cayman Islands, and others. There's the opportunity for implementing a stock transfer tax that our colleague Jim Henry is working very hard on, implementing an excess profits tax for which there is precedence, and then to have more automatic exchange of information. In fact, the US, as the largest economy in the world, doesn't participate right now in an OECD standard, which is the automatic exchange of information, because they'd much rather get the wealth from other countries rather than disclose where we got the wealth from. And it's very important that the US participate in this program, which all other countries are following. So we hope that the Biden administration will make some efforts in this regard. We have made some estimates as to how much this would bring to the US Treasury if some of these changes are implemented. If we reverse the provisions of the 2017 tax reform bill, there could be $100 to $200 billion a year in tax revenues. Stemming the abuse of tax havens, as we've mentioned earlier, the developed countries could regain about $300 billion a year by just getting rid of tax havens and replacing it with a corporate minimum tax or implementing some form of unitary taxation. Stock transfer tax, I mean, it's something that is a progressive tax, which only the wealthiest companies and individuals pay. It is not a tax that is paid by lower income, middle income people. The time for that tax has come, and I think that could also generate a significant amount. And then we talked about the excess profits tax. So, so there are many challenges that are ahead, and also opportunities for the new administration to take some strong action in this regard if we really want tax justice to be a pathway to social justice. But we have to remember that the lobby groups are very strong, particularly in the United States. I don't know if the same is true in Europe, and John could comment on that, but certainly in the US, the lobby groups are very strong to keep the status quo. Citizens United, under that Supreme Court decision, where there can be unlimited funding by corporate groups to politicians, that again keeps the status quo what it is. And there's also a revolving door between people in business and people in political positions, which tends to reinforce the situation as it is. So I think if there's going to be a recovery after COVID, we need to make some bold moves similar to what FDR was able to do, in spite of significant opposition from the business industry, to bring about reform. And it is within our reach to do so if those bold moves can be taken. So let me close with this quote that I found very meaningful, that hope has by St. Augustine, the 4th century philosopher, that hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. anger at the way things are and courage to see that they do not remain the way they are. And I think John Christensen is really a good example of this, because he saw what was happening in the companies that he was working at. He saw the injustice that was taking place, and then he formed Tax Justice Network as a way to address it. And I think that is that's an important segue for me to open it up to John. So Thomas, if you want, we can have some questions now, or we can have John Christensen finish and then open it up to the entire group for questions, as you wish.
So I would say if there are any questions more of an understanding type, we should probably hear them now. And if there is more discussion type questions, we do them at the end together. Would that be okay? Was it all clear, or are there any things that you would like to?
And I can make these slides available to the group, and they can reflect on it further
on the website. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I can have email correspondence with you, and we can discuss them further.
Oh, that's great. You are talking about the lobbies in Europe, but they are very, very strong also here in Europe, lobbies. So, it's not in the United States only, but in Europe also, lobbies are very, very strong.
Yeah. And what is the way to counter it? What is the tax justice movement have a strategy to counter it? I mean, that's a real big problem here globally.
Yeah, we are trying to get in touch with parliamentarians, but it's really, really very difficult. But we are fighting, so we are trying our best.
Harrison, you had a question?
Yeah, I had a quick clarification question about the calculations in terms of how much is being potentially lost for developing or developed nations. Is that calculated based on what the corporate tax rate is for in each nation, or is it calculated based on some idea about what would be the most equitable tax rate?
Yeah, if you look at the global trade of around $20 trillion a year, exports and imports, and if you consider that if you consider that global trade, 60% of the global trade takes place among related entities, which means corporation trading with a subsidiary and so forth. And 50% of those subsidiaries are located in tax havens. So there's a lot of opportunity for trade mispricing. So if you think of the global trade being 20 trillion, even if there's a 10% of the global trade that is either overpricing of exports or underpricing of imports, you're looking at 2 trillion. Just 10% of the 20 trillion is potentially taxable revenue that has somehow been misused, right? Now, if on that 2 trillion, if you look at a tax rate of maybe 30% or 25%, you are looking at close to $500 billion that is right there, that is not brought into the tax net. So, I mean, I'm just giving a very broad brushstroke analysis, but the IMF study that I can happily share with you goes into it in a lot more detail. But this has really been studied very carefully by the IMF, and that's what Joe Stiglitz points to very often in his commentaries, that because there is so much trade taking place among related parties, the opportunity for mispricing and to hide profits as a result of this, especially because most transactions are taking place with related parties, those opportunities are very high. And as a result of it, significant amount of tax revenues are lost. And just this one example of 20 trillion, 10%, 2 trillion, 25% rate, 500 billion right there, leave alone all the other opportunities that exist of avoiding income tax as a result of transfer pricing and continuing to keep income in Switzerland and in tax haven jurisdictions where it is even the income earned on prior shifted profits is not subject to tax because it is not communicated back to the home countries. all of that aggregates to a pretty high number. And, we are just looking at a 10% estimate of the total global trade. It actually could be a lot more. So that's how the numbers are derived at.
Yeah, and it's actual tax rates as they exist around the world, right? What you can see, and I showed some slides last time, what you can see is how there is a tremendous mismatch in where companies pay their taxes and where they have their employees, their assets, and their sales. And so if you reshuffle and say, suppose the profits are roughly where the assets, sales, and employees are, then you would get a sense as to how much taxes these companies would be paying if they weren't engaging in the profit shifting. So none of this involves hypothetical tax rates as from a God's eye point of view we might wish them to be or anything like that. This is just actual tax rates in actual countries.
Got it. Thank you.
So we have two more, Ryan and Enzo. Go ahead.
Okay, I guess I'll go first. So I had a question about the excess profits tax, and I was wondering how exactly would you choose a benchline for it? Because if you're taxing all of the supernormal profits that were being made, it would remove the signal to people outside the market that this was a profitable market, and there would not be an influx of more firms, and that would democratize the whole process and lead to a reduction in prices or better products. So how exactly, is it just subjective, how much of excess profits we would be taxing?
Well, if you go back to the example in the oil embargo in 1974-75, the government looked at what was the oil price before the embargo, which gave them an estimate of what was the average earnings of the oil companies before the embargo came about. And then they looked at how much the oil prices rose, and for no additional work or no additional exploration or no additional R&D, the companies were earning a much higher amount. And it was that difference that they subjected to the excess profits tax. Now, to the extent to which we can apply the same analogy to the US, if you consider the significant profits being made by Amazon, by Netflix, by Google, by Facebook, a lot of people are on their computers ordering online, and the profitability of these companies is substantially greater just as a result of the changed circumstances of COVID that enables people to just be locked in rather than being able to spread their wealth to other sources. So if there is a will, there's a way to really go back and to make some comparisons to what would have been a profitable environment for these companies, these major tech companies, pre-COVID and post-COVID, and then come up with an equitable system to tax them. As the example I gave, that if Jeff Bezos gave to each of his 75,000 employees $120,000 bonus, he would still be at the same place where he started on March 1, when COVID started in the US. So what I'm saying is that economists can come up with a reasonable approach to this issue because there's a precedent for it. And there's a law in the books that says that under certain unusual circumstances, this kind of a tax system can be imposed that would be in the public interest.
And so?
All right. My question is just whether we're looking to solve this problem at the point of origin or the final destination. Because if we're talking about this as a problem that we need to solve in the different countries of origin, let's say Zambia, for instance, I think most African countries lack the infrastructure to deal with this from within. And if that's the solution we're looking at, well, it might be a bit difficult to figure this out. Whereas if we're looking at solving this at the destination where these funds are hidden, it might also be a bit difficult. So I just want to get your opinion on how you think we can solve this from the perspective of the developing world?
Yeah, I think one of the big advantages, opportunities that exist for